right, everyone. So we're going to look at Claude McKay. Claude McKay was a very important figure in the Harlem Renaissance, in that his poem "If We Must Die," which you read, essentially was the catalyst for the Harlem Renaissance. He started the movement in a way, and he often doesn't get equal treatment in a lot of discussion of Harlem Renaissance as someone like Langston Hughes. So I want you to kind of keep in mind as we go through these poems how his poetry, his themes, and his style stacks up or compares to somebody like Langston Hughes, or even go back to W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. He spoke out against Du Bois. So the first poem we looked at is The Harlem Dancer. And The Harlem Dancer is about a young girl who is a stripper, perhaps a prostitute. And it's really talking about the difficulties faced by the people who live in Harlem and how white culture is really just a voyeur on that. So Langston Hughes, as you read, talked about white entertainment appropriating, the Harlem Renaissance, essentially trying to appropriate the art and literature and everything else, and how it was problematic. And he's calling out the white audience in this poem as a symbol or a metaphor for being a voyeur on this culture. And so basically we have this idea of this young girl who is dancing for this audience of men and women, which we assume are white. And he says that everything about her, the way he describes her, the imagery he uses is very graceful and elegant and beautiful. He says her voice was like the sound of blended flutes. She's graceful and calm. So everything about her, she's got this beautiful black hair that curls around her neck. Everything about her is stunningly beautiful, and he paints her as this human, fully fleshed out woman. But when you get to the part where he's talking about the boys and girls, he says they're wine-fleshed, bold-eyed boys, and even the girls devour her shape. They literally take it in with eager, passionate gaze. The gaze takes in her shape and appropriates it, and it becomes nothing more than an object to them. She's not human to them. She is an object to be devoured. He says, but I, as a member of her community, looking at her falsely smiling face, I see past what they see. So I see past just the object that they see, and I know herself mentally was not in that place. So she's doing what she can to escape from the horrors of her life in Harlem. Again, all of his poetry comes in sonnets, so it's not all of it, but many of these are sonnets with strict rhyme schemes, strict iambic pentameter. We have three quatrains and then a couplet at the end, so a turn. So the last two lines usually will give you some kind of alternate view or some kind of alternate idea. And that's exactly what happens in this poem. Harlem Shadows is a different structure. So we have 3 stanzas, and you see this kind of indentation back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And they're still a regular rhyme scheme, but what he does is he plays with enjambment in this one. So enjambment is when the line goes to the end and then it doesn't stop at the end. It actually goes into the beginning of the next line, as though the thought is not finished. So it's a little more stream of conscious style. And what he's doing essentially in this one is he's calling out society for the life, the style that they've created for the poor and the destitute in Harlem, and in the black community itself. And he's saying that, he says, I see in the shadows these shapes of these little white feet running, these little gray slippered feet running around from street to street in the night, and essentially running from one client to another, and they're just young little girls. So look at the words that he's described. He makes them very sympathetic. He says little slippered feet, dark girls go prowling through the night from street to street. So they are really victims of circumstances, and that's how he's painting them. These are not, seductresses. These are not older women. They're young, innocent girls. And so he says, through the low night, he brings out this idea that they have to slip through the night in secret. And we assume it could be black, it could be white, but whoever it is, they're taking advantage of these innocent girls. And he says, the last phrase, he says, and the stern, harsh world that in that wretched way of poverty, dishonor, and disgrace has pushed the timid little feet of clay, the sacred brown feet of my fallen race. So he sort of broadens the subject out from these poor innocent girls to the limitation of what is happening to the black community. And how it's really fallen into this situation of poverty and violence, and the violence is both within the community and without. And we're going to get to the Jim Crow laws in about 2 seconds. So just kind of keep these themes in mind. You see them running through his poems. Okay, we're going to go over the lynching now. The lynching is a really interesting read. It's a difficult one because it's talking about violence against this man who's been lynched for being black. And if there's a poem by Langston Hughes that I did not have you read called Silhouette. It's on page 879. It's about the exact same thing, and it's a different take on it. And I think if you're going to write about this one, I think you should go look at Silhouette as a good comparison between the two. But the lynching, basically, we have this idea of this man was lynched and burned, and he talks about the beginning how the spirit is sort of lifted up and brought back to God, and it's a cyclical idea. He says, he returned once again to the bosom of God. So with this idea of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, of his father. And he says, but the awful sin remains still unforgiven. So the awful sin against him, the violence against him, is not forgiven. And he says that it was given up by fate's wild whim. And it's very interesting that he paints this as part of fate, as if the young man had no choice in this. There was no way for him to escape it. The violence against him is something that he can't escape. And you're going to see that theme carried over into If We Must Die. And the lynching itself was not well received within a lot of the black community, simply because of this idea, because they thought that the idea of fate and having no control of what was happening to them was not something that they necessarily was not an idea that they wanted to buy into. And so he's really calling out the violence against them by saying it's as though we have no way of fighting against it, so it's on someone else to help us by looking at what's happening to us. And so he says the mixed crowds came, and he's sort of lamenting the idea of what the intrinsic violence in the white community that's not being solved. And he says these young girls, the women look, but there's no sorrow in their steely eyes of blue. And so the young girls feel no passion against the idea of voyeurism. They see the object, and it's nothing more than an object instead of a human being. And he's saying that's being passed out from generation to generation in the white community, and that is what is perpetuating this violence, and that's why it's a problem. And he says the little lads, lynchers that were to be, so the little white boys that are watching this, they dance around with fiendish glee. So it was a really awful image to kind of end with on this poem, because it's saying these innocent children are being perpetuated into this system of violence against the black community, and there's nothing that's happening to change it. So he's calling to action, but he's doing it in a sort of a subversive way. That gives us to If We Must Die. If We Must Die is much along the lines of a general calling his troops to sort of bravery before a battle. And it was very well received. And like I said, it was really the catalyst for the Harlem Renaissance, because he's calling out the idea of the African American community itself. It has its own identity here and its own togetherness, which is powerful and can be used as a way to fight back. And this is what he says. If we must die, do not let it be like hogs. We're not animals. Don't let us be pinned against the wall. He says, around us are the mad and hungry dogs. So he says, we are not the animals, they are. And so he casts this violent, offenders against the black community as dogs, and he calls them monsters, and he calls them a common foe. So he really links this idea of sort of the inhuman to this, as he calls them later, a cowardly pack. So they are thoughtless, they are animalistic, they do not have an understanding of what it is that they are doing. And he's saying that if we must die, so we now realize the violence against us is something that we can't stop single-handedly. So if we have to die, let us do it nobly. We will die with grace and dignity as human beings. We are not animals, as he says. We're not hogs. So he has this enjambment where he says the blood may not be shed in vain. He says if the blood is shed, if it has to be shed, and we die nobly, then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us through the dead. So they have to honor the dignity with which we die. And he says that will bring about, he says, for their 1,000 blow will deal one death blow. So he says that will bring about this change, this reaction against their violence through our own sort of peaceful dignity. And he says, what lies before us but the grave? Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. And that emphatic, but we are fighting back, is really a call to action. It's a call to the community to come together rather than be fragmented through fear. Okay, so Africa is a beautiful poem. It's about sort of what has happened to the community. So Africa was this wonderful place of life and vivacity, and he cast it as this mother figure. So he has this sort of personification of Africa as a mother figure, and he says they were suckling at thy breast, and he says there was young in the pregnant night, and then he moves to all of these sort of images of Africa, which are not only unique to their community, but which are rooted in biblical understanding of Christianity, which in this sense, we're talking in the Bible, not in Harlem, but, the violence that is being perpetrated against them is spreading all the way down to the Bible Belt especially. And so he's really calling out these Christian images as a way of sort of uniting both sides and saying, we all come from this, what he calls the cradle of power. We all come from this idea and this place. We're all connected. And so he says he says, the Hebrews were humbled at Pharaoh's name and cradle of power, but all these things were in vain. So he says, the glory of Africa, the glory of its time has tragically passed. It's dead, it's dying. And he says, the darkness has swallowed it. He says, thou art a harlot. So he moves from motherly, protection, powerful figure to a harlot. And he says, thy time is done of all the mighty nations in the sun. So he's lamenting the passing of its time of power. And through that, his own community. And then we move to America, which is a really interesting dichotomy. So we have this idea of America is this land of opportunity and freedom, and it's where anyone can be anything, is what is the ideals that our country is founded on. That is not the truth for everyone in our country, as we well know. But he says, he's fighting this sort of inner battle. So it's an inner monologue. It says, although she feeds me the bread of bitterness and sinks my throat her tigers too. So America is personified just like Africa, but it is not a benevolent figure here. It says she feeds me this awful bitter taste, and she has violence against me. The image of the tiger sinking its teeth into her neck, steals my breath of life. Even though she is that, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. That phrase is incredibly powerful, that dichotomy that he's saying, the cultured hell. And he says, their vigor flows like tides into my blood. So even though this nation is having a lot of racial issues under Jim Crow laws, it's still a place where I feel vivacity and a life coming to life. So he's saying things can change, things can grow and change. It's going to take some time. And he's saying, gives me strength to erect against her hate. She feeds me with her own hatred, is in other words what he's saying. And so he talks about how he'll rebel and he'll stand within her walls and not be scared. So he'll use his position of power within her walls, even though he's having all this hatred geared towards him as the speaker, to use that as a position of power to create something better and to fight against that hate. So he says, I know the days ahead, that darkly I gaze into them. I see her might and granite wonders there, beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking into the sand. So essentially this idea of the future can be either, it can go one of the two ways. It can sink into the sand, or it can be something that is bright and powerful. So I try to get through that as quickly as possible. Hopefully you guys like Claude McKay. You're going to go ahead and move on to the next assignment, and let me know if you have any questions.